Breathe in slowly and let your chest rise like the morning mist over cobblestones. Now release that breath gently and allow your body to settle like a letter folded with care. You are here and Rainhill is waiting. Nestled among the soft green hills of northern England lies a village wrapped in clouds and whispers. Its name is Rainhill, though the rain here is more of a sigh than a storm. The rooftops are steep and mossy, the windows small and round, and the chimneys always puff the gentlest trails of smoke. Children know the sound of the gravel path before they know their own names. Their days became shaped by the sun and the sound of the milkman's boots, not by numbers or chimes. The village continued in a peaceful sort of stillness, as though wrapped in a gentle blanket of forgetting. Its windows flicker with candlelight late into the night. Inside lives the last watchmaker. Tall grandfather clocks now stand silent in hallway corners. Church bells no longer ring. Even pocket watches have frozen mid-tick, their hands paused in indecision. And the bakery at the corner sends out the scent of warm honey buns as early as the sparrows start their songs. They say he once built a clock that kept perfect time with the stars. They say he spoke to a queen once, who handed him a timepiece shaped like a teardrop and said, "This holds a lullaby no one remembers." Whether these stories are true is unknown, but Edwin never corrects them. He simply smiles with his quiet eyes and continues his work. Yet there's one thing Rainhill no longer has: time. Some point to dawn, others to midnight. One, a great pendulum clock taller than Edwin himself, holds a robin's nest near its base. The birds come and go through a tiny window cracked just enough for wings. Every clock in the village stopped years ago. Not in a loud or frightening way, but quietly, as if time simply decided to rest. People say they stopped noticing after a while. Edwin is old in the way a tree is old-rooted, quiet, still full of listening. He polishes the brass, oils the gears, and sets the minute hands to where the sun last stood in the sky. This one had belonged to Edwin's mentor, a stern and gentle woman named Agatha, who believed that time was not a cage, but a story being told. The clock had not moved in over 30 years. Though the clocks do not move, he tends to them with reverence, as though they still held the heartbeat of the town. He wears thick spectacles that magnify his already patient eyes, and his coat smells faintly of cedarwood and varnish. But not everyone forgot. In the far end of Rainhill, at the bottom of a hill soft with daisies and lavender, there's a narrow house with shutters painted a faded seafoam green. His name is Edwin Finch. He is old, but not in the way of bones and breath. Each evening, after the village settles into supper and quiet talk, Edwin winds the clocks that no longer tick. Rainhill children speak of his home in a hush. Inside his shop, the air is soft with dust and light. Clocks of every shape hang from the walls, their faces kind, their hands frozen in delicate positions. On one particular evening, something changed. It began with a chime, soft, brief. So faint that Edwin thought at first it was his own breath catching, but no, it came from the farthest wall, where the oldest clock rested. Yet now, the hand had shifted. A single minute forward, Edwin's fingers, worn from years of careful winding, reached out and touched the edge of the frame. Warm, just for a moment. He looked around the room. Nothing else stirred. He returned to his bench, heart moving slightly faster, like a kettle about to hum. Outside, the village slept beneath a curtain of mist, and the clocks waited. Morning came gently to Rainhill. It did not burst through the windows or rattle rooftops. It arrived like the brush of a feather against lace, softening the colors of the sky and wrapping chimneys in golden breath. The scent of dew on chimney soot mingled with wild thyme in the hedges, and somewhere near the center of the village, a robin began to sing in 3, even though no one taught it how. Edwin Finch was already awake. He always rose with the mist, long before the baker's flour dusted the streets. In the stillness, he poured tea into a hand-painted cup. the kind with a tiny chip on the rim that his fingers knew how to avoid without thinking. His house creaked the way an old violin does when lifted out of its case. The long pendulum had not moved, but something was different. The wood seemed richer in color, the brass trim less dull. With each creak, Edwin murmured, "Yes, I'm still here too." Today, however, his eyes kept returning to the wall where Agatha's clock had stirred. A single tick, a single breath of time, and then stillness again. He approached it now, cradling his cup in both hands. He removed his glasses, wiped them with the hem of his sleeve, and looked again. Still nothing, but he felt it deep in his chest like a yawn held too long. He turned to the drawer beneath the clock bench. There, wrapped in silk, was a timepiece he rarely touched. The Queen's teardrop, a gift from Queen Victoria herself, given when Edwin had repaired a centuries-old French chiming clock during a quiet summer in London. She had told him, "This watch holds a lullaby no one remembers, but it always sings at the edge of sleep." Its hands had never moved. Its key had been lost generations before. It was small, delicate, shaped like a silver drop of rain and strung on a velvet ribbon. And yet, when Edwin touched it now, it was warm. Not the warmth of metal left in the sun, but the warmth of a held hand. He blinked once, then twice, and then the clock ticked again. Another minute forward. He sat down slowly, setting the teardrop watch on the workbench beside a magnifying lens and his oldest cloth. "Something's waking," he whispered. His voice echoed slightly in the quiet room, as though the clocks around him had tilted forward to listen. For the first time in years, Edwin didn't reach for oil or polishing cream. Instead, he opened the back of the teardrop watch and breathed, just one slow exhale into the delicate gears. And it answered, a tone, soft and distant, a hum not made by metal. It sounded like a lullaby. No melody he recognized, but it wrapped around his shoulders like a shawl knit of smoke and starlight. He closed the watch quickly, hands shaking gently. The humming stopped, but not the feeling. He looked toward Agatha's clock again. The town moved with the same quiet rhythm it always had. The pendulum had moved, just once. Now it rested in the opposite sway. 2 ticks, 2 breaths. Outside, the mist lifted slightly, and sunlight painted the shop windows in long golden stripes. He stood, walked to the front door, and for the first time in many years, he opened it not to sweep or greet the milkman, but simply to breathe in the morning. Children passed on bicycles, scarves trailing behind them. An old man in tweed walked his beagle. But Edwin saw it differently now, not slower, not faster, just with intention. Time, he thought, might not have stopped. Perhaps it had simply waited for someone to listen again. He stepped outside and looked up at the tall church steeple. The bell, long quiet, held a single bird nesting beside its tongue. It would chime again. He felt certain of it. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. And when it did, Rainhill would wake, gently, like tea steaming in an old porcelain cup. At the heart of Rainhill's high street, tucked between the post office and a window full of sleepy cats, sat a dressmaker's shop known as Thimble and Thread. She'd arrived in Rainhill with a basket of needles and 3 spools of French lace. Over the years, she stitched wedding gowns, christening robes, and delicate tea gloves for generations of Rainhill girls. Her voice had softened with age, but not her mind. She noticed things, especially things most others ignored. The sign creaked gently in the breeze, its golden cursive faded but elegant. Her cat, Moth, purred on the sill beside her, tail curled like a comma. Clara tapped the glass softly and narrowed her eyes at the road below. The scent of lavender soap drifted out through the narrow front door, where a small brass bell always gave the softest chime. Miss Quitter Thimble had lived in the flat above her shop for 64 years. as though the weight he always carried in his shoulders had loosened by some unseen hand. That morning, as the sun climbed its way through pearl-colored clouds, Miss Thimble stood at her window sipping rosehip tea. "Something stirring," she murmured. She saw Edwin Finch, the watchmaker, standing outside his home. His fingers were clasped behind his back. He was not holding a clock or polishing a dial. He was simply watching the light shift across the rooftops. Miss Thimble tilted her head. Edwin never lingered. Her entries were neat and careful. She had been recording the town's stillness for decades. Whenever a clock hiccuped or a chime rang faintly, she noted it down. The gears were unlike any he'd seen. Too fine, too intricate. They almost looked like spider silk spun from silver. As he adjusted the lens, something caught the light. Inside the deepest part of the mechanism, a tiny etching revealed itself, no wider than a strand of hair. He was a creature of timing and routine, or at least he had been. But today he looked different. Lighter, perhaps. Moth yawned. "You're right, my love. I should mind my business." But she didn't. A story captured in brass and breath. He thought of Agatha again and her words, often said without ceremony. Instead, Clara opened her journal, one she'd kept since 1974, and flipped to a section labeled "Unusual Movements, Rainhill Time." She picked up her pen and wrote, "March 3rd, 7:10 a.m., Mr. Finch stood watching the sky. Something gentle has begun. The way bread smells at dawn. The way a name lingers long after a voice is gone." She underlined gentle twice. "I found it tucked inside an old lining from the bishop's winter coat." Then she closed the book, gave Moth a scritch behind the ears, and began sorting through her buttons. Across town, Edwin returned inside and lit a small oil lamp on his workbench. The teardrop watch sat beside him, perfectly still. He studied it under his magnifying glass. It was the shape of a music note, a lullaby indeed. He leaned back in his chair. "It matched nothing I owned, but it looks like it belongs to a music box." This wasn't ordinary work. It wasn't about time or ticking hands. This was something older. Time is not for keeping. It is for remembering. He had once thought that meant marking anniversaries, birthdays, and seasons, but now he wondered if it meant something else. Maybe memory was the only true measure of time. Not minutes or bells, but the way air feels before a snowfall. A knock came at the door, soft, unhurried. Edwin opened it. Miss Thimble stood there, wearing her floral housecoat and wool slippers. "I brought you something," she said, holding out a parcel wrapped in velvet. Edwin took the bundle and unwrapped it gently. Inside was a key. Small, rested slightly, but shaped like the curl of a violin. Clara smiled. Edwin's eyes lifted. "Thank you," he whispered. Clara turned to go, then paused. "Edwin," she said, her voice soft. I heard it too. He nodded. No need for questions. As she left, the church bell swayed slightly in the mist. No sound came, but it moved, as if remembering how. That night, the wind over Rainhill was hushed and heavy, carrying the perfume of daffodils and chimney smoke. Windows flickered with the warm hush of lamplight. Inside Edwin Finch's workshop, the air was thick with memory. The little brass key Miss Thimble had delivered sat at the center of his desk, catching firelight like a spark held still in metal. Edwin didn't rush to use it. He let it sit for a while, just within reach, as he lit a candle and made a fresh pot of tea. Jasmine this time. It reminded him of the night his mentor, Agatha, taught him how to wind his first pocket watch. No grooves on the back, no typical keyhole. But just near the base, barely visible unless the light struck it right, was a curved seam. Not a door, but a hidden layer. Her home had smelled of beeswax and lavender, and she had worn a shawl with a stitched pattern of constellations. Back then, she had told him something he never forgot. Tucked inside, folded so finely it looked like a pressed petal, was a scrap of yellowing parchment. Every mechanism has a soul. Some tick forward, some tick inward. He picked up the velvet-wrapped teardrop timepiece once more, studying its shape. Edwin placed the violin-curled key gently into the seam. It clicked once, softly. The watch didn't start ticking, but it opened like a locket, revealing a small hidden chamber inside. He unfolded it slowly. It was a letter, written in elegant, looping script, the ink faint but intact. To the next keeper of the quiet hour, time is not lost in Rainhill. It is held in hushes. Something stirred beneath the boards, not sound, but memory. Inside it lay a sealed envelope tied with twine. Dust settled into its fibers like snow, but the paper was strong. The seal was a wax circle pressed with a rose and crescent. He had lived in the workshop for over 40 years. He knew every creak. But tonight, one board felt different. When the clocks are ready, they will remember how to sing. There was no signature, just a small drawing of a rose next to a crescent moon. Edwin stared at it for a long moment, then gently set it aside and turned his gaze to the floor. He moved the rug aside and knelt. The plank beneath was slightly raised at the edge, only by a fingertip's width. They remember you, even when you do not remember them. He lifted it. Underneath was a small compartment, no larger than a bread tin. He sat back on his heels, pulse quickening in that quiet way when wonder meets truth. The letter inside was dated March 3rd, 1897, exactly 120 years ago to the day. He read slowly, careful not to tear the edges. Edwin, if you are reading this, then the garden clock has begun again. Do not be afraid. The timepieces in your care have not stopped. They have simply paused to listen. Wind gently. Light the flame at midnight. Open the westward window. He hadn't touched it in years. Its hinges groaned softly, then stilled. The melody will return. There was no name here either. But the penmanship, the curve of the letters, the weight of the words, it was Agatha's. A letter written before Edwin was born. He placed it beside the parchment from the teardrop watch, the same rose, the same crescent. He sat in silence, lit only by the glow of the hearth and the slow turn of thought. The garden clock, the westward window, the melody. He stood, crossed the room, and opened the shuttered window that faced the wild bramble garden out back. Moonlight spilled across the floor, and just below it, in the garden's overgrown edges, something shone. A brass pendulum rising from the soil like a sapling. He had forgotten it was there, but it had not forgotten him. The garden behind Edwin's cottage was more memory than order. Years ago, he had planted neat rows of rosemary, foxglove, and creeping thyme, but over time the plants had followed their own pattern. The grass was cool beneath his slippers. The air smelled like sweet damp earth and faded mint. He followed the shimmer he had seen from the window, weeding between low hedges and overgrown herbs, until he stood at the far corner of the garden, spilling out of their beds and into one another like music notes that refused to stay on the lines. Ivy had braided itself through the rusted trellis, and honeysuckle had taken up residence in the curve of the old sundial. It ticked in slow, deliberate motions, like the sway of a lullaby being hummed just under breath. Even in disarray, the garden held a kind of reverence, as if the very plants remembered why they had been placed there. Now, by the silver shine of moonlight through the opened westward window, Edwin stepped onto the stone path with care. There, rising from the moss and shadow, stood a tall brass timepiece. It had once been a functioning garden clock, with long filigree hands and a pendulum that caught the light like a candle's flame. He remembered installing it with Agatha when he was just a boy, holding the compass steady as she etched the markings with her gloved hands. The breeze carried with it the soft creak of wood and the flutter of unseen pages. Over the years, vines had wound around its base, and its hands had stopped just after midnight on a spring night no one had bothered to recall. But now, something was different. The pendulum, which had once swung with the gentlest rhythm, was no longer still. Tick. And found what he hadn't seen in decades: a brass keyhole, hidden beneath the soil, worn smooth by time and wind. Pause. Tick. Edwin brushed back the ivy and placed his hand gently against the brass. It was warm. The kind of warmth that felt earned, not heated, as if the clock had been waiting for a reason to wake. He turned his head toward the house. The glow from the westward window now reached the base of the clock, tracing a pale golden path through the grass. Then, faint and far away, there was music, only a few notes. A melody so subtle that it might have been imagined or remembered or both. It wasn't coming from the house. It was coming from below the garden. The flame flickered against the damp stone, painting the garden in amber shadows. He knelt, brushed away a patch of clover near the base of the clock. The violin-curled key, the one Miss Thimble had delivered, was still in his pocket. Stars, moons, gears, petals, symbols of time and memory, of slowness and sleep. He slipped it into the keyhole, turned it once, and the garden clock chimed. Inside the sphere, dozens of tiny clock faces spun in slow motion, each ticking at its own pace, each pointing to a different moment in history. One face showed a snowfall, another a first kiss, another a child's hand reaching for a candle in the dark. Not loud, but clear. A single note, round and soft, like the beginning of a lullaby. The ground below him shifted ever so slightly, and a circular plate of stone at the clock's base trembled and slowly lifted. Beneath it, stairs. Old stone steps winding down into the earth. Edwin stood slowly, heart steady, and with the lantern hanging by the archway, he didn't hesitate. Step by step, he descended, the walls around him etched with markings he had only ever seen in Agatha's sketches. The air was cool and smelled faintly of pressed flowers and oil. At the bottom of the stairs, the tunnel opened into a round chamber, and at the center of that chamber was a clock. Not just any clock. A great sphere of glass and brass, suspended by chains from the ceiling, glowing with an inner light that shimmered like water. It was the heart of Rainhill, and it had begun to beat again. Edwin stood before it, awash in the light, and for the first time in many years, he did not feel alone. The chamber's light was not harsh, but warm and pulsing like a quiet breath. The great sphere at its center hovered gently, suspended by its chains with a grace that felt more like dreaming than engineering. The softly ticking faces within turned like petals on water, shifting in rhythm to something far deeper than ours. Edwin moved slowly across the stone floor. His slippers made no sound. The floor beneath him had been swept, not recently, but lovingly, the way one would care for a sacred room no one visited. He approached it, running his fingers over the carvings on its door, a rose, a crescent, and below them, the familiar initials, a VUF. He noticed shelves lining the circular walls, each holding objects wrapped in velvet or placed carefully into wooden trays. Watch faces made of polished shell hourglasses filled with midnight blue sand, and small timepieces shaped like animals' flowers, even a child's hand curled in sleep. Above the archway where he had entered, a phrase was carved into the stone. To remember is to awaken the hour. He mouthed the words silently. At the far end of the chamber stood a tall cabinet made of dark wood, almost black, but with a sheen like moonlight. Agatha Winifred Finch. On the wall above them, dozens of watch keys hung on silk ribbons, arranged in a circle. His mentor. She had left more behind than memories and oil-stained gloves. He opened the cabinet. Inside, he found a small table, a velvet cushioned chair, and a series of bound journals. He sat. His fingers brushed the spines of the journals, reading the titles. Year 1, The Ticking Garden. Year 3, Silence in the Steeple. Year 12, The First Pause. There were 27 in all. There was also a lantern, unlike any he had seen before. Its flame glowed from within a small orb of glass that seemed to shift between colors: amber, sea green, and the palest lavender. He pulled out the first and opened the cover. Agatha's handwriting greeted him with gentle steadiness. To the one who sits in this chair, if you are reading these words, then the clocks have stirred. You are the keeper now, as I was, and those before me. You are not alone, though Rainhill may forget what it keeps. It was not music meant for performance. It was a tune meant to be remembered, hummed quietly beside a cradle, passed from one dream to another. This chamber is memory. This garden is breath. A tiny door in the heart that opens only when the world is quiet. You will learn slowly. Begin with the melody. Listen, wind, record. Sleep when needed. Edwin let the words rest in his lap for a moment, then placed the journal beside him and reached into the drawer below the writing table. Inside, nestled in blue velvet, was a tuning fork and a silver key shaped like a falling feather. He picked it up and held it near the great sphere in the center of the chamber. For memories too soft to shout but too dear to lose. The clocks inside shimmered, their ticking growing softer, then stronger, then soft again, as if responding to the light. Of moments when a child stopped to stare at a snowflake, when a widow smiled at an old letter, when a pet rested its head in a lap. These were the true measures of time. Edwin closed his eyes. He listened. He waited. And there it was again, the lullaby. Stronger this time, threading through the quiet like wind through branches. He felt it press against something deep inside him. A locked drawer. A forgotten path. He opened his eyes, and he knew. This was not just a garden beneath his home. This was a sanctuary for forgotten hours. For moments that had slipped away from calendars and bells. He placed the tuning fork beside the lantern and returned to the journal. Tomorrow, he would begin the recordings. Not just of ticking clocks, but of silences. Edwin stood once more and looked toward the steps. He was the keeper now, and Rainhill was beginning to wake. The following morning, the air in Rainhill carried a different weight. It was not heavy, but full. A quiet fullness, like a quilt stitched with invisible threads. The villagers went about their routines, walking dogs, sweeping porches, folding laundry beneath lines of sun, but even they noticed something was stirring. Children lingered longer at shop windows. Birds landed closer to open hands. And beneath it all, a softness was spreading, a hush that hinted at remembering. In Edwin Finch's home, above the old garden, the westward window remained open. A thin curtain danced like lace in the breeze. On the workbench, the teardrop timepiece rested beside the tuning fork, the feather-shaped key, and the letter Agatha had once left beneath the floor. Edwin had slept only a little, not because he was restless, but because he did not need more. The garden beneath the house had filled something inside him, not with answers, but with calm. He sipped his tea slowly. Outside, the light filtered gently through the trees. He stood and gathered the silver lantern he had found in the keeper's room. It no longer changed colors, but had settled into a steady glow, the color of candlelight seen through silk. He fastened it to his belt and descended once again into the clock garden. The steps greeted him like old friends. At the base, the great glass sphere ticked with soft energy. The melodies inside it spun through moments Edwin could not name, each face within the globe turning like petals, caught in a breeze only the heart could feel. He approached the pedestal where the lantern had once sat and saw a small, shallow basin carved from stone. Water shimmered inside, but not with a reflection of the room. Instead, it showed tiny glimpses of other times. A woman threading a needle by moonlight, a baker letting a child roll dough, a fox curling beneath a yew tree. Edwin leaned closer and watched the surface ripple as his presence stirred it. Then he dipped the tip of the lantern into the basin. There was a soft hiss, not sharp, but like steam rising from freshly baked bread. The lantern pulsed, and within it, a tiny tick began. Not the tick of a gear or cog, but a heartbeat. A soft rhythm, slow and steady. The keeper's lantern had awakened. He lifted it carefully and turned back toward the shelves lining the room. There, tucked beside the oldest journal, he noticed a folded map. It showed Rainhill on sepia ink, its streets drawn like vines, its gardens like blossoms. Small symbols dotted the map clocks, hourglasses, even a small harp drawn beside the chapel. At the center was his own home. A rose was inked there, surrounded by a crescent moon. But something else was marked now, 5 stars, each glowing faintly with golden dust. He ran his finger over the paper. The stars were not just decoration. They marked something real. Places in Rainhill where time still listened. He traced the first. The old apothecary shop near the willow pond. The second. A stone bench beside the railway where no trains had run in 40 years. The third. Miss Thimble's sewing room. The fourth. The attic of the library where no one climbed anymore. And the fifth. The bell tower of the church, high above the village, its chime long since silenced. Edwin closed the map. The lantern flickered once, brighter than before. He understood. The keeper did not simply observe time. He gathered it, he wove it. He carried the flame of what had been and placed it gently where it was needed most. He returned to the surface. The sun had risen above the trees, casting gold through the garden. Birds fluttered between branches, and the wind moved through the ivy like a hand, smoothing an old letter. He stepped outside the gate and onto the high street, lantern by his side. As he walked, the ticking inside it stayed steady. And though he did not rush, each step felt like it belonged. He was the keeper, and Rainhill was ready to remember. The morning was still unfolding, slow and golden. In Rainhill, even the birds seemed to move with care, as though the entire village had paused for a soft breath. Edwin walked with the lantern at his side, its quiet pulse casting a warm shimmer across cobblestones and window panes. He carried the map in his pocket, worn but glowing faintly where the 5 stars were drawn. His first destination lay just beyond the edge of the willow pond, the old apothecary. No longer a shop, it had been shuttered for years. Ivy climbed its walls, and the sign above the door had faded so much that only a trace of the word remedies remained. Edwin approached the door, placing a hand on the aged wood. It opened with a gentle sigh. Inside, dust floated in slow spirals. Shelves still lined the walls, filled with old jars, bundles of dried herbs, and faded labels in looping script: valerian, chamomile, lemon balm. A small stool sat near the counter as though waiting for someone to return. But it was not the jars or the dried herbs that drew Edwin's attention. It was the clock. Small and round, tucked high on the back wall, its hands had stopped at 11:17. But as Edwin stepped inside, the lantern at his side gave a soft chime. The light from within it reached out like a thread, touching the old clock. Tick, tick. The hands began to move again, not quickly, but gently, as though remembering the rhythm of days when the shop was full of whispered prescriptions and steaming teas. Edwin stood still, letting the light settle. Then he took out the map. The star marking the apothecary now shimmered brighter for a moment, then dimmed to a soft, resting glow. The time had returned. Not loudly, but quietly. A memory restored. He left the shop with care, closing the door behind him. Next, he walked toward the stone bench beside the railway tracks. It was a path he had walked many times as a child, following Agatha as she gathered wild thyme and listened for the whistle of trains that no longer came. The bench sat beneath a wide oak tree, its arms smooth from weather and waiting. Moss had begun to settle along the edges. Edwin sat and listened. The tracks, rusted and covered in clover, were silent, but the lantern gave a single warm glow. In the stillness, a sound emerged, not a train, but laughter, echoes, children running with ribbons, a grandfather tipping his hat. Rainhill had not always been quiet. The bench had once been a place of greeting and farewell. It had held tearful goodbyes and hopeful returns. It remembered every embrace, every wave from a window, every promise to write soon. Edwin felt the ticking of the lantern slow, then hold steady. The bench had remembered. He stood, heart full and unhurried. 2 stars had awakened. He moved next toward Miss Thimble's home. He didn't need to knock. She was waiting on the porch, sipping her tea from a porcelain cup with violets painted on the rim. "I thought you might come today," she said softly. Edwin nodded. "There's something sleeping in your sewing room?" Miss Thimble smiled, not surprised. "The dressmaker's window has always caught more than sunlight." She led him inside. The sewing room was filled with scraps of lace and fabric, all folded with care. On the far table lay a music box she hadn't touched in years. It had belonged to her mother and her grandmother before that. Its key had long been lost, but the lantern pulsed gently as Edwin approached. He placed it beside the music box. The lid trembled. Then, as if remembering how, it opened. A lullaby poured out, sweet and slow, as if the air itself was humming along. Miss Thimble sat down quietly, her eyes shining. "I had forgotten that sound." "It hadn't," Edwin said. The 3rd star on the map had returned its light, and Rainhill, 1 note at a time, was waking. The 4th star on the map led Edwin to the edge of town, where the Rainhill Library stood with quiet dignity. Its walls were wrapped in climbing roses, and its windows blinked with age. Children still visited for story hour on rainy days, and students wandered through for poetry or old recipes, but few ventured to the uppermost level anymore. The attic was locked, not with a key, but with dust and time. The librarian, Mrs. Aldwych, gave him a quiet nod as he stepped through the wide oak doors. "Going upstairs?" She asked gently, as if already knowing the answer. "I believe something is waiting," Edwin replied. She handed him a rusted key from a drawer that hadn't been opened in years. "Take the lantern," she added softly. "It remembers more than we do." The stairs creaked underfoot as Edwin climbed. Paintings lined the walls, oil portraits of authors long past and the founders of the library itself. Some eyes seemed to follow him with calm curiosity, as though wondering who had finally returned. At the top, the attic door stood still. The wood grain was dark and rippled like water caught in freeze. The key slid into the lock with ease, as if it too had waited for this moment. The door opened with a breath. Inside, the attic was filled with old furniture draped in white cloth, as if each chair and table had dressed itself for dreaming. Dust floated like snow in the golden light that slanted through the arched windows. Trunks and boxes lined the walls, labeled in faded ink Summer Festivals 1903, Elder Council Minutes, Chapel Bell Roster, and at the far end of the room stood a long cabinet. Edwin approached, guided by the soft glow of the keeper's lantern. The cabinet was tall, reaching nearly to the sloped ceiling beams. Its doors were glass, but dust had rendered them opaque. With a gentle cloth from his coat pocket, Edwin wiped the surface clean. Inside, rows of notebooks stared back. They were not the journals of Agatha's kind. These were smaller, bound in deep blue, their spines stamped with gold lettering. Each one bore a child's name, beneath each name, a year. Some dated as far back as 1870. Edwin's own name was there, and Agatha's. Each child in Rainhill who had ever visited the attic had unknowingly left a piece of themselves behind. A drawing, a wish, a secret thought whispered while gazing out the attic window. The notebooks had recorded them all. He opened one randomly. "I think the moon follows me home," I told it my secrets. "I think it listens." He smiled. A drawing of a clock tower stood beside the words, tiny and imperfect, but full of heart. As he read, the lantern beside him pulsed once, then began to glow. The cabinet shimmered faintly, and the attic seemed to breathe. Somewhere beneath the floorboards, a floorboard settled. A whisper curled through the room like ribbon. Time had remembered, not just hours and days, but moments. He closed the notebook gently and placed it back on the shelf. As he turned to go, something else caught his eye. Tucked between the rafters, a small brass wind chime hung from a nail. It had no obvious purpose and had likely been there for decades. But the light from the lantern touched it, and it rang. Clear and soft, like a bell underwater. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Rainhill was listening and remembering. As he descended the stairs, Mrs. Aldwych met him with a smile. "You found what was waiting?" she asked. "I found what we'd all left behind," she nodded. "Then it will bloom again." He stepped into the street, the wind fresh with lavender and cedar. 4 stars had answered, only one remained. The bell tower. The walk to the bell tower led Edwin to the highest rise in Rainhill. The path wound through old stones and crumbling walls, places where the village's heartbeat was buried in moss and memory. The wind grew gentler as he climbed, tugging softly at his coat, stirring the lantern light into small circles on the cobbled path. The bell tower had not rung in nearly 40 years. The wooden staircase inside had bowed with time, but still held firm. Ivy had crept through the cracks in the stone, and little nests nestled in corners where birds had long claimed sanctuary. The scent of cedar and age filled the air, mixed faintly with the metallic hint of old bells. Edwin ascended in silence. Each step creaked in rhythm with his breath. Above him, the light from the top window spilled in a cool wash of white, like milk pouring through glass. When he reached the final landing, he paused, letting the lantern cast its glow upon the old iron bell. It was vast, heavy, beautiful. Once it had marked the hours. The births, the farewells, the days the town forgot and remembered. But now it stood still, a sleeping heart. He stepped into the belfry. The breeze moved through the slats, lifting strands of his hair, brushing against the collar of his coat. The lantern pulsed brighter here, as if recognizing the final thread it needed to stitch. Beside the bell hung a simple wooden lever, worn smooth by hundreds of hands. There was no rust, no rot, only waiting. The bell did not need repair. It needed listening. Edwin placed his hand on the lever and closed his eyes. He let his breath slow. He thought of Agatha's journals, of the basin in the keeper's chamber, of the lullaby in the glass sphere. He thought of the teardrop timepiece, of Miss Thimble's music box, of children whispering secrets into attic shelves. He thought of the map in his pocket and the 5 golden stars. He pulled the lever. The bell moved. A deep vibration rumbled through the floor, not loud, but present. Then came the sound. It was not a clang or toll. It was soft. A long, resonant chime, as smooth as silk, that rolled outward like fog over fields. The air shimmered. The breeze stilled. Down in the valley, shutters paused in their sway. Cats lifted their heads, and even the wind chimes at the chapel door grew quiet to listen. Rainhill had heard, and it remembered. The lantern at Edwin's side pulsed once more, then dimmed. Its work was done. He leaned against the wooden frame and watched the sun dip lower over the rooftops. The clouds moved slowly. Time itself felt slower now, not stalled, but softened. He turned to descend the tower. As he reached the base, a group of children waited outside the old gate, each holding something small. A daisy, a thimble, a broken watch, a feather. Miss Thimble stood behind them, smiling. "They heard the bell," she said, "and they brought what they remembered." Edwin looked at the line of small palms, each offering the quietest kind of treasure. "I think the town is waking." She nodded. It was always dreaming. He opened the gate. The keeper walked home with the lantern at his hip and the stars behind him. Rainhill ticked softly once more. That evening, as twilight painted Rainhill in shades of plum and silver, Edwin returned to the garden beneath his home. The lantern at his side had grown warm, not in heat, but in presence, its light now calm and steady, like the pulse of a sleeping village. The path into the keeper's chamber felt softer beneath his feet. The air was tinged with the scent of lavender and burnt tea leaves. Somewhere above, the last birds called to each other across the rooftops. Their songs were not urgent, just a murmur, like lullabies with wings. Inside the chamber, the glass sphere in the center glowed with a muted radiance. The clocks within had shifted slightly, their hands aligned not by numbers, but by stories. Edwin could hear them again, the melodies. They had grown. Now, instead of one lullaby, there were 5. Each one intertwined, like ribbons in the air. Each one born from a place on the map where time had returned. He approached the basin beside the pedestal and peered into the surface. Again, the water shimmered with glimpses of remembered hours. But now, the visions had changed. Where once they were soft, fleeting images, they now lingered longer. A child spinning in the apothecary with a paper crown. An old couple holding hands at the railway bench, their eyes closed. Miss Thimble humming beside her sewing table as the music box spun on. A teenager reading aloud in the attic, unaware of the bell chime above. Each scene lasted only moments, but they breathed. He sat by the pedestal and opened Agatha's journal again. She had written something he had not noticed before. When the 5th star glows, begin the winding. Let the threads meet. Then listen to what remains unspoken. He reached for the tuning fork and struck it gently against the lantern's edge. A clear tone rang out, one that wasn't heard with ears alone. The sphere stirred. Its faces began to rotate in sync. The hands, once scattered, now moved as a single unit. And from the center, something bloomed. A delicate mechanical flower, crafted from gilded gears and glass petals, rose from the core of the sphere. It shimmered with dew that wasn't there, and from its center, a single droplet of light lifted into the air. It hovered, then drifted toward Edwin's palm. When it touched his skin, he didn't flinch. It felt like warmth on a winter's morning. He closed his fingers around it and felt something open inside him. Not a memory, but a moment waiting to be born. The lantern flickered in rhythm with his breath. He stood and walked to the velvet-lined shelf where the keeper's keys hung. From the ribbon marked with the present year, he removed a small, clear key, not brass or silver, but crystal. He turned it in his hand. This was the key of now. He returned to the pedestal where a hidden lock had always rested just beneath the flower's roots. He placed the key into it and turned. The pedestal opened with a whisper, revealing a small drawer lined in velvet. Inside, a slip of parchment. On it, only 5 words, written in Agatha's graceful hand. You are not alone now. Edwin closed his eyes. The clocks ticked on, and Rainhill, in the breath between dusk and night, exhaled. Night settled gently over Rainhill, as if the stars had carefully tucked a blanket over the rooftops. From his window, Edwin watched the first constellations peek through the navy sky, blinking softly like curious eyes. A hush had wrapped itself around the village. The breeze barely stirred, and the air had the softness of a lullaby that had not yet been sung. In the hearth, the last logs glowed with a faint amber hue. Edwin sat in his usual chair, wrapped in his wool shawl, holding a teacup still warm with honey and thyme. The lantern rested on the mantel beside a stack of aged books and the narrow mahogany clock that had once belonged to Agatha. For the first time in years, that clock ticked with perfect rhythm. He sipped quietly, watching its hands move. The past few days had stretched like ribbon, unwinding pieces of Rainhill's forgotten melody. 5 stars on the map now glowed softly, each one a place where time had been remembered. But even with the garden's light restored and the keeper's tools awakened, Edwin felt something unfinished. It wasn't urgency. It was care. He leaned down beside the armchair and opened the old satchel, carefully lifting out the parchment map. and a bundle of faded envelopes. Their edges had frayed and the ink had softened into velvet smudges. Agatha had written them long ago, not to people, but to the hours themselves. To the hour of grief, read one. To the hour of wonder, said another. But the one Edwin chose tonight bore the name, To the Sleepless. He unfolded it slowly. Inside, the letter was written in Agatha's slanted hand, curved and calm. To the one who listens while the world sleeps, I see you. Not with eyes, but with memory. Yours is the hour of half-closed windows, of blankets not yet settled, of hearts that tick louder than clocks. You are the bell that doesn't ring, but still hums. You are the hush before the sun returns. You are not forgotten. The clocks know you. The lantern remembers. The garden waits. Edwin folded the letter, holding it gently in his palm. He thought of the people in the village, the ones whose windows glowed long after midnight, the ones who paused by flower beds without knowing why, the ones who never quite said what lingered in their chests, the quiet ones, the lonely ones, the listeners. Perhaps it was time to leave something behind for them. He stood slowly, walked to his desk, and gathered a stack of blank paper. Using Agatha's old pen and the steady ticking of the lantern as his rhythm, he began to write. Some notes were short. Do you remember how snow sounds when it falls? You're not the only one awake right now. Others held verses. Even the moon has shadows. Even shadows are part of light. And a few were simply blank with only a gold star drawn in the corner. He wrote until the ink bottle emptied, then bundled the letters into neat stacks tied with twine. He wrapped a scarf around his shoulders, took the lantern in hand, and stepped outside into the cool hush of the village. Rainhill breathed with him. Each doorstep he passed, he paused. Sometimes he slipped a letter under the door. Other times he tucked one into a flower pot or wedged it gently into a window frame. No name, no explanation, only soft offerings for whoever might need them. Children would find them. Elders would puzzle over them. A baker might tape one beside the register. A seamstress might sew one into a pocket. But someone, perhaps someone wide awake in the quietest hour, would find one beneath their pillow and smile without knowing why. The keeper's garden was not only beneath his home. It was beginning to bloom in every corner of Rainhill. And it started with paper, ink, and listening. The morning arrived slowly in Rainhill. The sky wore a blanket of soft cream and blue, the kind of light that filtered gently through lace curtains and warm teacups left forgotten on bedside tables. As the town stirred, not with the clamor of industry, but the hush of memory, Edwin stood in the center of his garden, watching the lantern sway slightly from its hook on the trellis. Something had shifted, not in the world beyond Rainhill, but within it. Children skipped past his gate, eyes alert to corners and windowsills where a folded slip of paper might still be hiding. Shopkeepers dusted their counters with a softer hand, their minds briefly caught in fragments of memory, an old lullaby, a scent from their childhood, a question they once asked the stars. There was more light in Rainhill, though no extra sun hung in the sky. Edwin turned toward the hidden stairs that led to the keeper's chamber. The wooden steps creaked like old friends greeting his wait. Inside, the sphere at the center of the room was glowing with a steadiness he had not seen before. Not flickering, not calling, simply being. It was time to preserve what had returned. He opened the tall cabinet behind the pedestal where the keeper's records were held. Each shelf housed a series of leather-bound volumes, the keeper's archive. Each spine was etched in silver ink, the year of rain, the year of sleep, the year the bell stopped, and more. The names were poetic, chosen not by date, but by what Rainhill remembered most vividly from that season. And now it was time for a new volume. Edwin took a fresh journal from the lowest drawer. Its cover was soft and pale gray, like the color of fog when it rests over wildflower hills. He dipped his pen in fresh ink and turned to the first page. He began to write. This is the year of the lantern's bloom, The year we remembered how to listen to the quiet. The year time woke up not with a clang, but with a breath. As his pen moved, the air in the room grew warmer. The sphere at the center shimmered faintly, and then something surprising happened. The lantern, resting silently beside the pedestal, gave a single pulse of gold light. From its base, a thin filament of light rose and drifted across the room, coiling through the air like a thread of moonlit silk. It floated toward one of the chamber walls and touched the stone gently. There, as Edwin watched, words began to etch themselves, not his handwriting. Agatha's, and not a letter or an entry, but something older. A phrase, "When we begin to remember, time begins to dream." Edwin breathed in softly, placing his hand over his heart. He stepped closer, running his fingers over the glowing phrase as it slowly faded, becoming part of the wall itself. There were others now appearing, little by little, as though the lantern's light had begun to reveal messages left long ago. Each one a whisper, "Kindness is a kind of clock. The hour you rest is the hour the world leans in. Even shadows belong to the garden." He closed the journal and placed it gently onto the shelf with the others. The new volume. The year of the lantern's bloom. Then, without speaking, he turned to the drawer beside the pedestal and took out the second keeper's ring. Each keeper was given two, one for the work, one for the invitation. He held it in his palm. Polished silver with a single gold thread that spiraled along its band like a helix of time. Tomorrow, he would choose. He would find the next keeper, not to replace him, but to walk beside him. Because time, Edwin now understood, was not meant to be kept by one. It was meant to be shared. Morning sunlight slanted softly across the cobblestones of Rainhill, casting golden halos through leaves and lace curtains. A hush lay over the village, not of silence, but of intention, like the gentle breath one takes before lighting a candle. As Edwin stepped onto the street, the silver ring tucked into a velvet pouch in his pocket, he felt the weight of the moment, not heavy, but sacred. Rainhill had always known who its next keeper would be. The choice wasn't made by votes or lineage. It was whispered through moments, noticed in gestures, revealed through the way someone paused at a chime or traced their fingers along the grain of a wooden clock face as if listening. Edwin made his way through the square, past Miss Thimble's shop where colored thread glittered in the display window, past the bakery where the smell of warm cinnamon floated into the air like a memory you could taste. A child waved to him as he passed. Her palms were smudged with ink, and she held a folded slip of paper that she refused to read aloud, tucking it into her sleeve like a secret. He smiled. Then he saw him, Leo, a boy of 12, maybe 13, often quiet, always watching. He sat near the railway bench, sketching something on a square of parchment with a pencil worn to the nub. Edwin paused a few feet away, not wanting to intrude. Leo looked up, eyes steady and clear. "I saw the bell chime," he said softly. "I know," Edwin replied. They said nothing more for a moment. The train station clock ticked behind them, its hands frozen at 9:10 permanently, as no one had wound it in years. Yet Leo sketched it anyway, pencil tracing every crack, every flake of worn paint, every missing deer. "It doesn't move," Leo said, "but it's still right twice a day, and that's enough?" "For some clocks," Leo shrugged, "but not for me." Edwin smiled and reached into his pocket. He drew out the velvet pouch and opened it slowly. Inside, the second keeper's ring glinted softly in the morning light. Leo stared at it, then at Edwin. "Why me?" he asked, no pride in his voice, just wonder. "Because you notice the hours other people ignore," Edwin said. "And you know when something has stopped moving, not just with your eyes, but here." He tapped his own chest. Leo swallowed. He held out his hand. Edwin placed the ring into his palm, and the moment it touched his skin, the air around them shimmered like light moving through glass. Somewhere far beneath their feet, the lantern pulsed once. In the garden beneath the keeper's home, the clocks aligned themselves, ticking in time with a new heartbeat. Later that evening, Edwin brought Leo into the chamber. He watched the boy's eyes widen not in excitement, but reverence. Leo walked slowly around the glass sphere, pausing to read the names on the old journals, his fingers ghosting over the titles like a pianist remembering a long-lost melody. When he reached the pedestal, he did not ask questions. He simply listened. The sphere stirred. Just a breath, but it was enough. "You won't always understand it," Edwin said. Leo nodded. "That's all right. Some things are just meant to be held." That night, as the village lights dimmed and stars curled into view like ink stains on silk, Edwin stood in the garden and looked up at the lantern. Its flame had shifted, no longer only his, but theirs. And Rainhill exhaled again, softer still. A week passed, then two. The lantern in Edwin's garden glowed with quiet purpose, never flickering, never fading. It had become part of the town again, just as the chimes on the hour were part of the breeze. And the scent of time and memory curled up through the soil in spring. Rainhill no longer hurried. It listened. It paused. It remembered. Edwin's role as the soul keeper was ending, not in sadness, but in grace. He still visited the chamber each morning, still dusted the journals and turned the winding keys, but now Leo walked beside him, asking questions with his hands more than his voice. The boy moved with a kind of stillness that grew from deep listening. One afternoon, as mist curled along the ground and light fell through the trees like threads of spun sugar, Edwin returned to the old railway bench. It had always been his favorite place to think. He sat with a satchel by his side, the same one that had carried Agatha's letters for so long. Inside was a new journal, the final entry he would write. He opened it with steady hands, took a breath that smelled of moss and sun-worn stone, and began. Time is not something to control. It is something to walk beside. To keep is not to own, but to tend, like a garden or a memory. He paused and continued. Rainhill does not need a keeper. It has thousands. Every child who hums a forgotten tune. Every neighbor who waters their flowers before dawn. Every pair of hands that still bothers to rewind a music box. He signed his name at the bottom, not with his title. Just Edwin. He closed the journal and tucked it beneath the bench, inside the hollow where someone else would one day find it, perhaps a child with questions, perhaps a grown heart who had forgotten how to listen. When he returned home that evening, the lantern was waiting, its light softer than before. The sky above Rainhill was a tapestry of gold and lavender, and the bell tower, silent for so long, now echoed once each day, not for timekeeping, but as a reminder that some hours are not meant to be measured, only felt. Edwin lit a candle beside his window and placed the last of Agatha's letters beside it, to the hour of home. As the wick danced, he watched the garden sway outside, and he knew his work was done. Epilogue. The night garden. Down in the chamber, Leo traced the silver lettering on the new journal. He had begun one of his own. Not a record of what was, but what might be. And somewhere within the sphere, a soft melody began to play, one that had not been heard before. Not a memory, a beginning. Outside, in the cobbled quiet of Rainhill, cats curled on porches, tea cooled in painted cups, and children tucked notes into books and coat pockets and hollow trees. And above it all, the lantern glowed, for those still awake, for those just falling asleep, for those who kept time without ever knowing it. Rainhill ticked on, but now it dreamed too.